Let's see, we're starting over. We are now calling the meeting of the Department of Finance Committee to order.
Sorry.
All good. Just noting that we have Deb and Max here from the committee present, and then we have one board member in the room, Hal, and one board member online, Lisa. And I'm not seeing anybody else. I saw a couple of people come in. It looks like Brenda's joining us. And so we, first item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Is there any changes to the agenda?
I have none.
So noted, the agenda is approved. It's presented approval of the minutes. We have the November 17, 2023 minutes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I move to approve the minutes as presented.
Consider those approved.
You can ask for public comment. We have Mark Sabatini.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is there anybody here from the public that wishes to address the committee? Seeing or hearing none. Thank you, Anita. Now we'll go to the August 2023 financial statement review and discussion / CFO report. And Joe is online. Joe, it's all yours. Joe, you're muted.
Just testing out the mute, see, make sure it works. So I was going to talk about the October financial performance, if that's all right.
Yeah, what did I say?
August.
Oh, I'm
This is
sorry.
August.
Yes. October, please.
Okay, so financial statements are included in the packet. So what I'd like to do is kind of go over the current situation, work plan, and then open it up to questions at the end. And so as we went through the month, there's several things that me and Ian and my team are looking at. Well, first, we're looking at Medicare reimbursement. We did finalize the 2023 cost report, and we're trying to analyze that for any potential missed reimbursement, either through allocations of costs or programs we're not going to. So we've actually reached out to 2 companies to help us review our last 3 cost reports, 21, 22, and 23, to make sure our base year is good, and then we have all our allocations in place to maximize our Medicare reimbursement. We're also looking at the contractual allowance model. So there was some larger adjustments during the month for contractuals and patient side. So we're actually doing a full review of the allowance model to make sure that's accurate. And it's accurately stating what's due to us on the receivable side. I've been spending a lot of time working with Anthony and the various accountants on the accuracy and timing of financial statements. So right now we get our statements out. I think I finished October, the first part of December. And so we're trying to get that down to about somewhere in the 8 to 10 business day range to start a month. I'll be doing November when I get back next week. So still outside where we want to see that. So we're trying to tighten up our financials and get those cleaned up. On top of that, with some of the things that impacted the financials during the month is we have a lot of immature services, I'd call them. So we have home health and hospice where we have costs going out the door, but we're not recognizing it and we don't know on those services yet. And that has to do, we have to pass our final state review or CMS review. So we get a P10 assigned to us so we can bill for those services. And then on the Wildflower Court side, we are recognizing revenue and expenses in our financial statement, but we haven't done a full rollover. So we don't have all the costs associated with Wildflower Court, like depreciation, and all the balance sheet items haven't been rolled over. So our balance sheet isn't quite accurate. The biggest impact of that would be their accounts receivable on their side and the cash that they're holding. Those are kind of the high level things we're looking at. We also are working on point of sale collections with PAS and PFS, so we can start collecting more cash when the patient is at the in front of us before they receive the service. This week I learned that we are starting the 2020 Medicaid desk review. So that's where Medicare comes back in and reviews that cost report for accuracy. I have Anthony supplying all that documentation as we speak. And me and Anthony will have our 2025 budget kickoff meeting next week, so we can get that process rolling as well. Let's see. Well, one last note. I want to make sure that everyone, I imagine this has been talked about, but starting January 1st, Medicaid will start reimbursing our inpatient services under APR DRG methodology versus a cost-based methodology or a per diem methodology. And so that goes back to, they have a DRG assigned for every admission that's based on diagnoses, age, all the stuff that goes into the patient care. And that basically has a number associated with it times our base rate, and that calculates what our reimbursement is. And so in the last 2 weeks, they did some training this week. We're trying to understand the impact to us. The state assures us it should be cost or reimbursement neutral to us, but still trying to wrap our hands around what that's going to look like starting January 1st. That's it. That's a lot of info. So let me know if you have any questions.
Any questions from the committee?
I have no questions.
Before I open up to board questions, I guess I'd like to go back through a few of these items. And let's talk first about the cost report and I guess the work that you've been doing, Joe, to you and Ian have been doing to kind of get your heads around, opportunities that Bartlett might have with respect to Medicare reimbursement. Where do you see that going and essentially that process going to try to evaluate that?
Okay, yeah, the first step is we've engaged 2 different companies. One I've worked with in the past, it's more aggressive with cost report, and one Ian's worked with. And so what they'll do is they'll do a review of the last 3 years. So 21, 22, 23. We'll send them all the work papers. They'll look at all our different allocations. And basically they should come back with they'll come back with suggestions on how to maximize our cost allocations for Medicare reimbursement. And some of this goes back to, as you change allocations, Medicare has to buy off on some of them. So you have to submit some of these requests prior to the end of this fiscal year for them to be go live next year. But there is other things where they can change, like some of the A6 adjustments on the cost report. That's where they're moving expenses between departments. There's some stuff they could do on that could impact prior years. And we could see some change in, 21, 22, 23. Does that answer your question?
It does. I got a follow-up or two here, though. So the timing for these 2 consultants to work through there, I mean, what are we looking at? Is it 30 days or 120 days, or do you have any sort of sense on that?
I really can't nail that down yet. I have a kickoff call with Ian's company, I have it noted here, next week. And then I'm trying to get an agreement tied up with the company I worked with in the past. So I'm hoping to have that nailed down next week. So we're really just at the front end of this. It goes back to how many resources they have to allocate to this project and how fast it goes. So I can't even give you a timeline.
Okay, so maybe at some point in the future, next meeting we can. And as far as the prospective versus retrospective adjustments, prospective, those that have to be approved by Medicaid would take. Medicare. I'm sorry, Medicare would take effect for 6/30/24 or 6/30/25.
25. So
25.
if we request it this year, like if we request it in March, it'd be applicable in the next fiscal year, not this fiscal year.
Yeah.
July 1st through June 30th, 2025.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then but there might be some opportunities that they may or may not identify, but it's something they're looking at that potentially could affect reimbursement for the closed year and the year we're in right now, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. The next question I had to do with your close window, and I appreciate very much you working to get that tightened up, and that's great. I mean, more timely and accurate financial information is good, and as part of that, I know you're looking at the model and the way that's structured for booking, cost. I want to talk about just the accounting backbone itself, Meditech. Is there a possibility that maybe the Meditech software that we're using right now, you might look at potentially replacing? What are you thinking about there, Joe?
It's something me and Ian has discussed. So Meditech is probably the least user-friendly accounting software I've ever touched. And so much of our time, my staff's time, goes into doing just 1,000 journal entries because all the systems don't talk to each other like a modern cloud-based system would. And add that on top of the central treasury function we have to fight through every month. I mean, we're just doing 1 million journal entries, and the visibility into our financials isn't as clean as some of the newer systems. So as we're trying to get, hold directors accountable for our expenses, they have to own those expenses and be able to have visibility into them. But right now we have to run 3 different reports so we can tell them what that expense is.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So we're working real hard to just keep the system going and keep financials coming out versus the system doing a lot of the work for us. So, I mean, there's a lot of potential in a new system, and it's something, I think we should go for rather soon.
Yeah. So, I mean, is that in the near future, or is that kind of as you get some of the other issues? I mean, looking at potential replacement of Meditech.
So in the perfect world, I spend the next couple of months getting Meditech, all my GL cleaned up, right? And so I know where all my issues are because I can get it as clean as I can, but with all these outside systems working into it, we still have issues. But once I get the system clean, have a firm understanding of where we stand, then you can start proceeding and looking at new softwares and then doing a full implementation. But it's something where you potentially put into next year's budget. So you never want to do it right before you close your year because you don't want to be going through an implementation and trying to do audit, cost report all at the same time. You want to close your year out, get all that, your books closed out and clean, and then go into implementation, somewhere in the first quarter of that next fiscal year.
Great. And you touched briefly on billing for Wildflower Court. And if you just give us a brief update on where we are as far as that. I know when we met as a board, Kim Stout was waiting for an on-site. And has that happened? And I'm throwing both Wildflower Court and the hospice and home care into that question.
Yeah, I haven't heard no updates if they've come to review the license. I know Tammy talked to our Noridian rep on our PTAN, and he said it's on his desk. He'll have it done within the next week. But we've heard that promise before. And the PTAN is really what's going to drive all those billings. So once we get that in place, Medicaid will take their steps to get their PTAN in place, and then all the commercials will follow suit, and then bills start rolling out and money will start rolling in. And I don't have any updates on hospice or home care. I don't know if Ian does. Oh, I think
Kim
we had.
Stout.
Yeah, Kim is on here. Kim, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you have any update or any new information from the last board meeting, Kim? And if not, that's fine, just to get an update if there is one. Now, let's see, she's on mute. She might have had to step away. And then the final question I had is this new Medicaid billing methodology. It's kind of a DRG kind of basis, but for Medicaid, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And so like the basis for our Medicare, like the backbone, how they reimburse us on the day-to-day claims is basically a DRG basis.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
To the chair, thank you. So how close are we to seamlessly implement that reimbursement, that type style of reimbursement? Are we prepared for that?
I guess I'm not understanding the question.
So reimbursement changes. We have to calculate our contractual allowance a little bit differently based on DRGs. Are we prepared for that in our system?
So we have software, it's 3M, which does our coding. So we bought the APR DRG module, which they can turn it on January 1st when they can turn it on. And then
Okay.
once they do that, we can start running reports and getting some of that information back out. So I can look at January's and be a little tricky, but as we get a few months experience, we'll be able to, we almost have to do it on a claim by claim basis to start, just so we make sure we're good on those ones. Does that make sense for the contractual analysis?
It does. Thank you.
I meant to ask you about the contractual model as it relates to the review by these outside consultants on the Medicare approach. And I'm just curious. I mean, I know you've got a lot of irons in the fire, but you've got a kind of a daunting list of things you're dealing with here. And I think it's fair for us to, just as the board, to give you and Ian the chance to implement, to really do a thorough review of, how we're recording some of this data and the impact that it's having on our financials. And I think what we're hearing from you is that, the information we have, while it's, it's calculated accurately based on the systems we have, we might be needing to make some improvements to the system itself in terms of the way it's generating information. And I guess, first of all, is that fair? And, and then I guess the second question is, or maybe it's more of a statement. I want to make sure that this board isn't arbitrarily setting any sort of deadlines for you in terms of getting that stuff done. I think, what's important is we have a thorough and accurate, reasoned evaluation of all this stuff so that we can move forward. And I just, like your kind of thoughts about that, Joe. Or Ian.
Yeah. So I agree that, so when we're trying to analyze a contractual for reimbursement, it's probably the most complex set of spreadsheets I've ever seen, with a zillion formulas and a zillion ways to mess it up. And so as we try to test that, it is a time consuming process, and you have to make sure you're right. And so I'm pulling reimbursements over 2 different years, trying to tie back to a single date to make sure that this thing is actually calculating what it should be calculating. We're not misstating our balance sheet and our income statement. I think your statement's fair. It's like, this takes time and it's kind of unknown at this point.
If I could just add that, Meditech, we use on our clinical and billing system, but it's also a system that was developed for general ledger. Over the last 2 decades, because of the electronic health records, all the money on that system development went into the billing and clinical system. And then the financial part of that is just, Bob Cratchit in 1890. It's just old. So what that does for the leadership is that we don't have the timeliness of information, and to get the accuracy of the information, we're using a lot more power, individual manpower to be able to put that together. And so we don't necessarily have a tool that helps us manage our business on a timely basis. And so that's why Joe is saying, I gotta basically have a maybe 2-pronged process. I gotta make sure that everything is accurate and moving along in my balance sheet and P&L. And then we go into a process where we will get ourselves on a new general ledger that is probably part of the cloud, but very easy to use, so we can get really good and timely information out quickly. As part of that process, we also have to be able to do let me step back. The biggest and most important part of accounting in healthcare is revenue recognition. What do we actually recognize our revenue be? And the reason that's difficult is because we're paid so differently depending upon who. From Medicaid to Medicare to private pay, different private payers pay differently, and self-pay. And then that's just for the hospital. Then you have different payment mechanisms from home health, hospitals, and so forth and so on. So the accuracy of those revenue recognition, what is our value of our AR and what's the value of our revenue cycle, is what Joe is talking about, of how do we actually do that. And so we need a better process to be able to be not only more accurate, but more timely, so that management can have information out to our managers and hold them accountable for resource utilization within a reasonable time period. The time period that's reasonable, depending upon a number of different factors, between 8 and 4 business days. If you go 8, you're dealing with more accurate information. If you go with 4, you're dealing with more estimations. So again, the CFO has to determine that. But once you close the books, you should be able to get your management reports out within a business day or 2, so you can start holding people accountable. Did you use the resources well, and understanding what your business processes are? So I think what Joe's been telling me in his, 15 days here, something like that.
Yeah.
In order to be
What's taking you so long, Joe?
Joe, yeah. Well, he actually started talking to me day 2.
Yeah.
But in order for us to really do a good job of leading and managing a resource, we need to be able to fix some of the underlying tools that'll be able to do that. And then that's coupled with accountability. Like, why aren't you managing within your parameters? Is really a couple of things that are really important. And as you can see, the states decided to change how they pay, and you have almost, a month or less to really deal with that. So from that standpoint, each payer can change every year how they want to pay. We all always have to adapt. So Joe has a lot of work ahead of him, and we're real supportive, but it's going to take some time. It's going to take, probably through the rest of the end of this fiscal year to flush out all the issues, figure out where the holes are, and the revenue cycle that we need to plug, make sure that we have billing up and running after we get our surveys done at the other entities, and make sure that we are providing up-to-date accruals on the things that we have to estimate. Joe, I don't know if I explained that well. Maybe if I was off, you could help correct
I'd say
it.
you know that.
Any questions from the board members here or online?
Well, I'm just a little bit curious. So Meditech has all this data in it, but we want to turn that into information. And I think now that's just being done, if I'm hearing this right, it's just being done with huge, complicated spreadsheets. Is that?
Well, Meditech has different modules to it. So there's what you would call the revenue cycle. That's admitting, discharge at the end, all the clinical documentation. So electronic health records are really married to the revenue cycle. And that is where they put their money in. There's other parts below that, there are modules that are general ledger and accounts payable and payroll. All of those don't necessarily meet the needs. And I don't think you can expect Meditech to put money into that, because the revenue cycle and the clinical cycle is not only is it mandated, but it's really their bread and butter.
My question is, how is this hospital going from the data in Meditech to information that gets distributed to the board? Are you using Meditech's tools that you're saying are inadequate, or are those being done with huge, complicated spreadsheets?
It's both. We're using their tools, but to supplement those tools, we're using a lot of spreadsheets. Joe, you can help me here, because I haven't been into the accounting into the accounting department.
Yeah, and so if you take payroll, for instance, we have all these different ways to pay people, based on union contracts, doctors, leadership, all the different ways. Meditech, the payroll module, doesn't have the capability to manage all those effectively. So Chris spends, I think it's 12 to 14 hours per pay cycle just tracking all these one-off issues to make sure we can pay payroll right. And then those need to be fed back into the journal ledger. And so those are the type of, hours we're just using so we can make the system work for us versus, the system doing the work for us. Does that make sense? And so we're using the tool, but we have to supplement it with all these spreadsheets to make it actually work accurately.
Well, I guess in my one last question, you're trying to envision a better way of doing things. Are you still seeing lots of spreadsheets, or is there a tool that that go
Yeah, so like
by.
the hospital I came from, we had implemented a cloud-based software. It's called NetSuite, and there's several of them. There's Sage. There's 3 or 4 that do this, do it well, where they actually partner with usually a payroll provider such as Kronos, and then they build all the stuff on the back end. So you're not managing this. It's just they put the hours in, the system does its work, and it processes payroll, and it populates your general ledger, and everything's seamless. So you're not doing a ton of journal entries. The system does them all for you on the back end.
They
So
establish
you're-
these tables, whether it's payroll or whether it's AP or even the allowance model. And one of the ones he talked about, Sage, I'm more familiar with than I wish I was. And, we implemented that at our company, and it's amazing the difference that a purpose-built web-based system that has the ability to use relational databases where you can set up these systems and collect non-financial data as well in the system. And that non-financial data then you can use to extract. You think about, for example, the number of hours in an aircraft flight. If we collect that by route, we can match that to our revenues and get some really powerful data that comes out of that. Meditech doesn't have the possibility to do things like that. And so what they're having to do is, number one, it's either not getting done here, those types of relational things, because we just don't have it, or number two, it's very heavy in terms of number crunching. And, Sam and I had talked about this, and, he had worked like crazy to build these, like our graph tools and stuff. And so the idea would be that with a more modern system, you can do a lot of that stuff literally at, not the push of a button, but, much more efficiently. As Ian said, get it out pretty quickly.
Typically in the modern systems, I've had IT reporting to me since the 80s. What you see in the modern healthcare systems, you see a layer that's the revenue cycle clinical process. Then you see another layer that is HR payroll, because, over the last 20, 30 years, the amount of detail and regulation in those has really changed your systems from just, pay card and or salary. And then the third layer typically is supply chain, financial reporting, general ledger. And so what we're talking about right now is how do we have a general ledger where it is easy to get all that information pulled in, and we can redeploy our folks to higher value areas. So for example, like pro formas. Pro formas is, if we want to get in the business, how do we develop a pro forma on that? We got all of our accountants just trying to get day-to-day stuff in, where there's tools that would facilitate significantly all of that data. And it's well known in terms of how these three relate. With the first layer, it's the revenue per department interfaces. Those are pretty well known. And the other one coming up would be payroll into general ledger. That's really simple, easy work, and they can be all automated. So you want to use the technology to automate as much as you can so you can redeploy people into higher value pursuits.
It's important to understand the conversion lift. I mean, Joe, you've been through a conversion of a system like this, I'm sure. I mean, just describe, in some general terms, what's involved from getting from point A, Meditech, to point B, NetSuite or Sage.
And so the kickoff call, they go over like all your current processes, what you're doing, which basically they probably throw out because most of what we're doing is just Meditech specific. And then you'd spend the next 2-3 months going over building all your tables, all your general ledgers, all your materials, everything that's in the back end of the system, or rebuilding it as is. And then you have to make sure that those all feed up into the reports, and then you do testing, and it's just, so when we went live, it was 6 months of this process. And so it is a heavy lift to get going. And so we'll probably need some help just to make sure we can continue on with the day-to-day, plus get the system built right. And so we're not dealing with ongoing problems because we skipped a step or we tried to expedite the process. I mean, the build is the most important part of this. And then the system will work for you once you got up. There will be bugs because there's stuff you miss, but like you work through those in the first 2-3 months and you have a nice clean system, and you have tons of extra power to start analyzing data and make changes. Is that kind of the question you asked, Mass? I'm trying to not.
Yeah, it is.
too much.
You know, as it relates to the, you know, if you think about the classical installer for a new system, I mean, the good news is in the healthcare industry, there's installers that are out there that can help you through that process. Is that fair?
Yeah, so we used iDaily in my current hospital to help us build our system, NetSuite.
Oh, yeah.
And there's lots of companies that specialize in the different softwares. I mean, I think there's 4 or 5 good companies for every software there's out there.
Yeah, gotcha. Brenda?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. But I have a question. I guess it would apply probably in the revenue cycle, which is, okay, as we're looking at preparing billings that go out so that we're getting our money in. And I think this would apply particularly to Medicaid and Medicare, which is a big driver. At what point in that system before the billings go out is there communication with the clinical side to make sure that all appropriate documentation that supports any billable service is in place? That everything from establishing medical necessity to because without that, as we know, when the Medicaid audits happen in particular, they sample. And if they find a certain incidence of error, then the sample becomes wider. So anyway, and I'm just real concerned because that's fast moving and that could be automated. It probably is now.
Yeah, Joe, did you hear that question?
There was some background noise, so I caught pieces of it.
Generally, the issue that was being brought up is before a bill happens, what is the methods that we have for collecting the clinical information so that the bill, when it drops, is as accurate as possible
And
Yeah.
and is in compliance?
And so that's why we have case management, social work as part of the revenue cycle. So they help us on the front side when the person's in the bed upstairs to make sure that we have medical necessity met, that we have all that we do CDI. So we're doing documentation improvement as that person's actually on the floor. So we have all that information. And then when the coders review it, they could do some query. It's minor now with all the CDI work we do. And then so that's the catch at the end, that when they code it, to make sure that what we're billing is supported by the documentation.
Yeah, they basically have backed up. If you think about the classical quality control, quality review process that you have post, you know, where you're looking at treatment plan, treatment note, for example, in mental health, they've backed that up inside the system. So before it gets to the coding function for billing process, they've already evaluated that as part of the, you know, just
By that time,
at
it's
the time
automatic.
services are being provided.
And the only
Yeah.
problem, I guess, in a review through the chair would be in a review, if it was felt that the treatment note or something in the treatment plan was not appropriate or whatever, that's a separate issue.
Right.
But automatically it would verify that there's a substantiating note, which is authorized by a treatment plan that's been signed off by appropriate person.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Generally, what you're looking for, besides the necessity, is the patient in here for the right reason, right? And that we have a process for making sure that doesn't occur. Your clinical systems are set up via the documentation
Mhm.
to collect that information. And so when you want to improve that, you look at, are we documenting well? Or have we automated things well? So for example, you know, do we automate the administration of drugs? Usually you'd have a wand and you take their barcode and you do the, you know, so when you look in the revenue cycle systems is the clinical documentation process, the CDI, where you're collecting the right information. It's automated as much as possible. It drops down into a bill, you scrub the bill. And then once you think it's gone through they're called scrubbers, but once you get through the scrubbing, then you drop the bill and believe that it's accurate. What we have to do then to get good bills, we have to go all the way back to the beginning of the process. Is the patient in here for the right reason? Are we collecting data? That's why when the docs say annotate, you know, they just want to list out and we want discrete data. You can collect discrete data. You can't collect annotated data.
Oh.
It's hard. Well, you can the old way. You'd have someone go through the medical record and you'd have a stack of medical records. So the systems are built for that level of data collection. And what we have to do is always making sure that we're collecting the right data. The systems facilitate that. So we don't have to go back and pull 50 different records. And
Just
You
all
remember
needs to
those
be
days.
Integrated so well.
Yeah,
right.
painfully remember. Okay, we are, I had one more question that I missed before. I just want to touch on it a little bit more. You mentioned your comments, and that is the collection of ability to pay at the time of admissions. What's your goal and what's the work you're doing there, Joe?
So we're starting our focus on self-pay patients that are coming in. And so we have a tool called AccuReg that's able to take usually it's tied to like lab and radiology, their outpatient procedure, generate an estimate so we can do upfront collections. Actually, the upfront collection starts before the person actually enters the hospital. So we're sending text or email, whatever mode of communication we have. And so they know what's expected of when they walk in so we can collect those amounts paid. And so at this point, we're running self-pay collections. We're collecting very little at point of service. And so the bar is pretty low. So we're taking baby steps to move this forward. It's going to be a shock to some of the patients that have been coming in here for a long time to have to pay their bill and, or their copay when they walk in the door. Did I answer it? So we're starting small and we're looking to expand.
Yeah, and the goal there is what? The goal is that when you're able to get somebody lined up on a payment plan or collect, you're avoiding future bad debt, right? That's the idea.
Absolutely, yeah. And so it should drive down your cost of collection significantly when you do it up front.
Yeah. Thank you. Are there any other questions on the financial report? I think that's it. I want to conclude. That's the end of our agenda. And I just want to say I appreciate it. I have had the opportunity to meet with Joe and Ian on this, on a couple of, the direction they're heading on this. And I guess it's important to remember that we kind of started on this last March and April, and then we got distracted, and so we're now coming back with a new team, getting back to some of the things that we had talked about 6 or 7 months ago. And so it's great. And I really appreciate how quickly you guys have really gotten to the nut on this thing, both.
Well, I really appreciate having a seasoned CFO come in.
Yeah.
That has worked in cost-based reimbursement. It really is a skill set that is not prevalent out in the industry because almost everyone is paid under DRGs. But, Joe has a lot of that experience, so we're really lucky to have him. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. Well, are there any other comments from the committee or the? Okay, great. From board members, none? Hearing none, we're adjourned. Thank you.
We'll see you on Tuesday.
Yeah,
See you next week.
Wednesday. Well, Tuesday is Santa's. If you guys are coming to that. And then Wednesday is the board meeting.
I will be in the South Pacific.
I'll be there. For both.
Shucks. Got any help?
Thanks a lot, Joe.
Yeah, talk to
Have
you
a
guys
good
later.
holiday. Thank you.
You too, bye-bye.